Joined now by Republican Senator from Wyoming, John Barrasso. Senator, thank you so much for being on the show. It's good to have you.
Great to be with you. Great to be with both of you.
Hoping you can hear okay. All right, I know it's loud. So listen, we were just talking about, with my colleagues there, obviously this is J.D. Vance's night. Reuters has him quoted describing you as one of his mentors, as somebody who has helped guide him through this political landscape. Tell us about that relationship and what you're expecting from the senator tonight.
Well, you know, he is going to be forceful. He's going to be effective and clearly conservative, but appeals to so many people he did in the Senate, and he now is across the country. He can really talk to those lunch bucket Democrats who have been disaffected, lost by the Democrat Party because the party has gone so far to the left them behind because he grew that life. He grew up in a hardworking family. He learned those lessons. He was a Marine. But when you read the story of his life, Hillbilly Elegy, you know a man that has experienced life and the pain that so many Americans have been feeling after 3.5 years of the Biden administration with high prices and open borders, all of those problems that we are facing. So I'm looking to him to be a great unifier for our party and really help President Trump get elected in states like Pennsylvania, not just Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, the battleground states, and help our Senate candidates there as well.
We'll talk about this idea of the so-called Rust Belt boost, if you will, as some of the reporting that we have here at NBC News indicates as we get into the political nuts and bolts of this. I've been talking to sources, of course, around the campaign, people here on the floor who suggest he can help, like you are saying here, supercharge turnout in some of those critical battleground states. How do you see his political impact come November on the ticket?
Well, I think he helps. I think, you know, President Trump was ahead in so many of these battleground states even before the debate with President Biden, where we showed many problems with President Biden today. J.D. now just, I think, will add to that advantage that President Trump in these specific states, as well as elevate our Senate candidates in those states.
You're talking Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. All of those are states that are pickup opportunities, and even in his home state of Ohio, turnout's going to be higher there. President Trump was going to win anyway. I think it really helps Bernie Moreno carry the Ohio Senate seat against Sherrod Brown.
Have you had a chance to catch up with Senator Vance in the last couple of days? I know it's been a whirlwind.
Talked to him last night by phone, and he's doing well. We're going to have a lunch for him tomorrow here with just his Senate colleagues, people that have worked with him in the Senate and some of those who are running for the Senate, so we can congratulate him and send him off on the campaign trail, knowing that he has the full support of each and every one of us.
You have obviously taken care of a lot of business in the Senate as it relates to foreign policy, and that is a big issue here. That is the big theme tonight on night 3 of the Republican convention. We know that the senator has been a vocal opponent in Congress against additional funding for Ukraine. Are you comfortable in your position with the way that a Trump-Vance presidency would pull America away from helping one of its allies?
Well, I think that actually what's going to happen with a Trump-Vance presidency is more peace through strength. First of all, I think that if Donald Trump had been in the White House, Ukraine would have never been attacked by Vladimir Putin. I think that would not have happened at all. You know, when I talk to J.D. about these specific things, he talks in our conference. I'm chairman of the conference. We get together every week. His concern is with China and us having enough weapons and the capacity to make the weapons that are needed at a time when we've been giving weapons to Ukraine, weapons to Israel, and with China being the long-term threat to the United States, that we want to make sure that we have the military wherewithal and the force that we would need to maintain peace through strength, and not just to invite aggression against us, because after the way that President Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, we lost a Wyoming soldier as a result of that. You know, we all these Marines that were killed. I think that just set us up for aggression by China, by Russia, by Iran, by North Korea. All of them got more aggressive as a result of what was viewed as a very weak America and a weak American president.
Let me ask you about something else that has come up as it relates to Senator Vance. He's made some comments about the 2020 election, including saying in a February interview that it had problems. He has suggested he would not have immediately, if he were vice president, certified the election results as you yourself did. How do you reconcile that election denialism with where the party is and with where the country is on that front?
Well, you're right. I certified each of the states, and there were irregularities in the 2020 election. There were irregularities in every election. Well, that's the difference between widespread fraud and irregularities.
But I want to ask you about Senator Vance specifically. If he were vice president, he would not have done what Mike Pence did. You supported what Mike Pence did in backing and certifying the election results in 2020. Does that give you pause?
I have great confidence in J.D. Vance as vice president. I have great confidence in him doing the right thing if he's vice president of the United States.
There's also this issue of a debate because we know that based on our reporting, Vice President Kamala Harris has spoken with the newest vice presidential nominee here in Senator Vance. TBD on if they're going to agree to one. How would you counsel your mentee on whether or not to do that?
Talk about your life, your faith, what this country means to you, and the future of America. Take a look at where we can go to the future, and don't hold back. You might have seen him on the Sunday shows, and he is very aggressive in defending the positions. I think he does a very good job of talking about an America of the future, what he has come from, what every American has come can have, that what they're coming from, and what they can be in the future, and the opportunities that are available in this country. And it's a great story of someone who's come from very, very poor upbringings, joined the Marines, disciplined himself, worked hard. Now he's a father, young children. His life experience, I think, prepares him very much for this job that he's about to undertake.
39 years of life experience, which is not nothing, but it is a relative degree of political inexperience, given that he is in his first term here. Does that concern you in any way here, that he could be a heartbeat away from the presidency at that age, with that experience?
Donald Trump got elected with no political experience, and it didn't seem to harm him and his ability to get the job done. JD is prepared for this job. I'm ready to support him. I'm happy that he's been nominated. It's going to be a very strong team, and we need, it's more of that than the presidency. We need a full Senate, lots of Republicans in the Senate, a Senate strong majority in the Senate and in the House, along with the president, to get a shared agenda for growth for America, growing the economy, not growing the government, which is what the Democrats tend to want to do.
Before I let you go, obviously the assassination attempt against the former president on Saturday night has been looming over this convention. I know you understand, and I've seen it on the floor, a celebratory mood, but there is still obviously that shadow here. We see it with that bandage on the former president's ear. As it relates to concerns about the Secret Service response, it's our understanding there was a DHS briefing. Did you participate? What can you share with us, if anything, from the unclassified portion?
Yeah, I participated in the whole thing. To me, it was a cover-your-ass briefing by the Secret Service. The director of the Secret Service needs to go. That shooter was identified as a suspect, suspicious character, a full 1 hour before the shooting occurred. Had a rangefinder, a backpack, and then they lost sight of him and never really followed up on that. This was an hour before.
That's what you heard today in this briefing.
We heard today in the briefing.
60 full minutes.
60 full minutes from the time he was identified as a character to be looked at, and then they lost track of him. There didn't seem to be any bit at all in this whole briefing of anyone held accountable. I wanted to ask a question. I talked to other senators who wanted to ask questions. We were cut off from doing so, and we had questions that we were able to say, wait a second, what really happened there? Who's going to be held accountable? Who was in charge of that building? Why wasn't the roof scrutinized? How did all these things happen? They didn't answer any of those questions for us. A man was killed protecting his family. The former president of the United States was almost killed. It was completely unsatisfying as a briefing. I think they just did it because they felt like they had to check a box instead of actually providing us the information that the American people need to know. The FBI gave about half of the briefing. They didn't even get called until 20 minutes or so after the shooting occurred, in terms of, was this part of some other plot? But we needed to know what happened. How could this have occurred this close to the death of a former president? We didn't get any kind of satisfaction. Time for the head of the Secret Service to go.
Were there any other aspects to the briefing that concerned you, in addition to the timeline piece of it, that hour reference that you talked about here? We're just trying to get an understanding, as we have been reporting out at NBC News what happened here, what the TikTok of it essentially was and where those lapses were. What can you share?
Well, they gave a TikTok of what he might have done and searched online days in advance.
Did they say who was responsible for monitoring and enforcing that route that he was on?
No, they talked about a federal and a state and a local authority working together as a team, and as I say, that did not satisfy those of us who were on. They really never did talk about the several minutes around the shooting. Never got to that. It was like what was happened before, and then how the president was taken off and how much time he spent at the hospital and what they did with his treatment, as opposed to what happened right then. How was that missed? Why didn't the American people know about what happened right then? And how did that shooter get that close? 130 yards is not, for people that go hunting and think that's not that far away. How could that person get to that location with a perfect shot at the president? And there, but by the grace of God, he'd be dead.
Clearly, you have many more questions, Senator. We appreciate you coming on a newsy day for you and ahead of a big night for somebody who you know well, in Senator J.D. Vance. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.